Wind turbine is a device that will convert wind into mechanical movement, which we can use to power water pump or electricity generator. Now the power that the turbine creates is obviously dependent on the wind speed. It also depended obviously on the number of sails, the area of the sails and the angle of the sails makes to the wind. So you can imagine if the turbine blades flat onto the wind's going to just bend it. If there is slight angle when the wind hits it, it's going to turn the blades. We can use that for powering things. Now, we're going to have a go, making some of the very simple paper windmills, a sort of things that you can make from the bits and pieces lying around home, and use that to drive very small generator to power electronic devices. I'm 43 years old, and I owe tens of thousands of dollars in student loans. Oh sure, I knew the loans were piling up as I went through school. But with one loan coming from here, another from there, I had no idea of the rock slide that was building. 15 years later, I still experience moments of sheer horror regarding my family's financial situation. My monthly student loan payment is more than triple my car payment. Okay, so without my college degree, I would not have been able to get my current job. For that I'm grateful, but at what cost? My loans have been accruing at a rate of 10%, and now they have burgeoned to, well, I'm an English major, you do the math. I don't think they'll ever get paid off. We're in debt way past our eyeballs, and there's no hope in sight. I'm being kept in class of financial class of graduates whose only hope for attending college meant borrowing money from the government. Because of our mounting credit card debt and monthly payments that far exceed our family's income, my kids will also join the class of citizens who can rely on their parents for college support. Do I wish I'd chosen another educational route? You bet. The brain is basically built from the bottom up. First, the brain builds basic circuits that are responsible for basic skills, and then more complex circuits are built on top of those basic circuits as we develop more complex skills. Biologically, the brain is prepared to be shaped by experience. It's expecting the experiences that a young child has to literally influence the formation of its circuitry. It's built into our biology. The interaction between genetics and experience that shapes brain architecture is embedded in a reciprocal relationship, the relationships that children have with the adults in their lives. And by that we mean what we refer to as the serve and return nature of children's interaction with their adults' development. And the impact of experience on development is not a one-way street. It's a back and forth interaction. The brain is a highly integrated organ which has multiple sections that specialize in different kind of processes. So we have parts of the brain that are involved more in cognitive function and other parts that are involved in processing of emotion and parts involved in seeing and hearing. So if a child is emotionally well, put together and socially competent, that will affect more positive and productive learning. And if a child is preoccupied with fears or anxiety or is dealing with considerable stress, no matter how intellectually gifted that child might be, his or her learning is going to be impaired by that kind of emotional interference. If your recruiting efforts attract job applicants with too much experience and near certainty in this weak labor market, you should consider a response that runs counter to most hiring managers' MO: don't reject those applicants out of hand. Instead, take a closer look. New research shows that overqualified workers tend to perform better than other employees, and they don't quit any sooner. Furthermore, a simple managerial tactic, empowerment, can mitigate any dissatisfaction they may feel. The prejudice against too good employees is pervasive. Companies tend to prefer an applicant who is a perfect fit over someone who brings more intelligence, education, or experience than needed. On the surface, this bias makes sense. Studies have consistently shown that employees who consider themselves overqualified exhibit higher levels of discontent. For example, overqualification correlated well with job dissatisfaction in a 2008 study of 156 call center reps by Israeli researchers Saul Fine and Barak Nevo. And unlike discrimination based on age or gender, declining to hire overqualified workers is perfectly legal. But even before the economic downturn, a surplus of overqualified candidates was a global problem, particularly in developing economies, where rising education levels are giving workers more skills than are needed to supply the growing service sectors. If managers can get beyond the conventional wisdom, the growing pool of too good applicants is a great opportunity. Baron Erdogan and Talia N. Bauer of Portland State University in Oregon found that overqualified workers' feelings of dissatisfaction can be dissipated by giving them autonomy in decision-making. At stores where employees didn't feel empowered, overeducated workers expressed greater dissatisfaction than their colleagues did and were more likely to state an intention to quit. But that difference vanished where self-reported autonomy was high. People appear to born to compute. The numerical skills of children develop so early and so inexorably that it is easy to imagine an internal clock of mathematical maturity guiding their growth. Not long after learning to walk and talk, they can set the table with impress accuracy: one knife, one spoon, one fork, for each of the 5 chairs. Soon they are capable of nothing that they have placed 5 knives, spoons and forks on the table, and, a bit later, that this amounts to 15 pieces of silverware. Having thus mastered addition, they move on to subtraction. It seems almost reasonable to expect that if a child were secluded on a desert island at birth and retrieved 7 years later, he or she could enter a second grade mathematics class without any serious problems of intellectual adjustment. Of course, the truth is not so simple. This century, the work of cognitive psychologists has illuminated the subtle forms of daily learning on which intellectual progress depends. Children were observed as they slowly grasped or, as the case might be, bumped into concepts that adults take for quantity is unchanged as water pours from a short glass into a tall thin one. Psychologists have since demonstrated that young children, asked to count the pencils in a pile, readily report the number of blue or red pencils, but must be coaxed into finding the total. Such studies have suggested that the rudiments 9 of mathematics are mastered gradually, and with effort. They have also suggested that the very concept of abstract numbers, the idea of a oneness, a two-ness, a threeness that applies to any class of objects and is a prerequisite for doing anything more mathematically demanding than setting a table, is itself far from innate. Today 150,000 farmers in India have committed suicide in areas where seed has been destroyed, where they have to buy the seeds from Monsanto and buy every 8 very high cost, and that high cost seed is getting him into debt, and the debt is pushing them to suicide. What we've done is create community seed banks, places where we collect and save seeds, rescue them from disappearance, multiply them, and then distribute them according to farmers' needs. And about 40 community seed banks have been created across the length and breadth of India. Places where these have been created, farmers are not in distress because the biggest cost today is seeds and chemicals. These seed banks are now being a new place where we can respond to the new crisis of globalization on the one hand and climate change on the other. Globalization has led to farmer suicides. We are able to take seeds to the suicide zones and distribute the seeds so that farmers can bring out of that dependency, grow food crops, get out of debt. We've been able to create community seed banks to deal with climate change, for the extreme flooding, the new en routes, the cyclones, the hurricanes that lead to salinization. And today for us the work on seed has become the place from where we are responding to the worst tragedies and the worst crisis of our times. Mary Mallon, better known as Typhoid Mary, was the initial person in the United States identified an asymptomatic carrier of the microorganism associated with typhoid fever. She was presumed to have contaminated 51 people, 3 of whom died, during her job as a cook. She was twice times forcibly separated by public health authorities and died after an overall of nearly 3 decades in isolation. From 1900 to 1907, Mallon worked as a cook in the New York City area for 7 families. In 1900, she worked in Mamaroneck, New York, where, within 2 weeks of her employment, residents developed typhoid fever. In 1901, she moved to Manhattan, where members of the family for whom she worked developed fevers and diarrhea, and the laundress died. Mallon then went to work for an lawyer. She left after 7 of the 8 people in that household ended up being ill. In 1906, she took a position in Oyster Bay, Long Island, and within 2 weeks 10 of the 11 family members were hospitalized with typhoid. She changed jobs again and similar occurred in 3 more households. She worked as a cook for the family of a wealthy New York banker, Charles Henry Warren. When the Warrens rented a house in Oyster Bay for the summer of 1906, Mallon went along too. From August 27 to September 3, 6 of the 11 people in the household fell victim to typhoid fever. The disease at that time was unusual in Oyster Bay, according to 3 medical doctors who practiced there. Now I like the history, and one thing I want to go over briefly is a history of epigenetic research, and this is from my perspective now. I got into this field in the early 90s. And what I have here is plotted publications, total publications, and function of time here. And on a linear graph. So what I did for this is I wanted to show that basically up until around the year 2000. There's an inflection point right around 2005 right in here where it looks like basically nothing really is happening much in the field of epigenetics. To the point where it's actually going vertical and a lot is happening in field of epigenetics. Now if you plot this rather than on linear paper, semi-log paper, what you will find is that what I'm showing is an exponential growth curve for publications in the field of epigenetics. And that in the scientific community, there's a doubling of the epigenetics papers every 1.5 to 2 years. Last year alone we put into publication summers between 15 and 20,000 papers, which took us 15 years from 1992 to 2005. Advertisers spent over $100 billion worldwide in 2000, and consumer product advertisements accounted for a little under half of that. What did they get for it? Does advertising actually work? does it that is persuade customers to pay a premium price for the extra intangible value which a brand confers on a product. Some businessmen say that one cannot quantify the effect of advertising because it meant to have an unquantifiable effect, such as improving product awareness, reinforcing brand loyalties, or increasing total consumption of a product category. However, that hasn't stopped advertising executives from trying for many years to prove the clans that advertisements have a very quantifiable effect indeed on sales. Advertising is, of course, only a part of the total marketing mix. Thinking up the product or service, naming it, deciding its price, getting it to retailers, arranging the shelf display are all important too. Advertising was very successful in American Britain during the 1950s and early 1960s. It slowed down in the early 1970s and totally collapsed in the recession of 1974-1975. With the economic recovery from 1976 through 1979 came some improvement. But higher media prices pushed up total expenditures. By 1990, that expenditure in most places had regained its real pre-1974 level. The 1990s were not good though. Although spending on advertising grew slowly in France, Britain, and Japan, only in Germany and America did it increase significantly in real terms, and that was mainly because of the 1996 Olympics, the American elections, and export drives in Japan and Germany. The key to forming strong brain architecture is what's known as serve and return interaction with adults. In this developmental game, new neural connections form in the brain as young children instinctively serve through babbling, facial expressions, and gestures, and adults return the serve, responding in a very directed, meaningful way. It starts very early in life when a baby coos and the adults interacts and directs the baby's attention to a face or hand. This interaction forms the foundation of brain architecture upon which all future development will be built. It helps create neural connections between all the different areas of the brain, building the emotional and cognitive skills children need in life. For example, here's how it works for literacy and language skills. When the baby sees an object, the adult says its name. This makes connections in the baby's brain between particular sounds and their corresponding objects. Later, adults show young children that those objects and sounds can also be represented by marks on a page. With continued support from adults, children then learn how to decipher writing and, eventually, to write themselves. Each stage builds on what came before. Ensuring that children have adult caregivers who consistently engage in serve and return interaction, beginning in infancy, builds the foundation in the brain for all the learning, behavior, and health that follow. This is a bomb calorimeter. This is the actual piece of equipment that researchers used to calculate the energy content of either biodiesel or maybe even the potato chips that you had for lunch today. When they calculate the amount of energy, they're going to calculate it in heat units, which would either be joules or calories. I want you to look inside the bomb calorimeter. Inside here, you can see that there's a silver bucket. Water goes all in here, and this is actually the bomb, is the smaller silver cylinder. What you do is put your fuel sample in there, then these two electrodes are connected to the bomb. These provide the spark that will ignite your sample when your sample burns or combust, that gives off energy. So how is the energy collected, or how did a scientist figure out how much energy is being given off? Well, it's a closed system. There's a lid here that goes on top of this calorimeter, and what's in here in the lid is a stirrer. The stir is going to stir the water that's in this big pool here, so that the heat given off from the sample is going to warm the water in a uniform way. This is the temperature probe. This goes down in the water also and measures the change in temperature, because as the sample is burned, it will give off heat and the temperature the water will increase. So the lid goes on, the sample is prepared. The last thing that you need to make a combustion reaction happen is oxygen, and at some point during the process, some oxygen is added by a tank that's connected to the calorimeter here. So we are going to burn a sample of the biodiesel that you've prepared and get some feedback on the energy content of it. You'll be able to use this to compare it to petroleum-based fuels like octane. So the way a mother rat takes care of its pups is by licking and grooming, nipple switching and arch back nursing. So the rats that do a lot of licking and grooming and their last rats that rule very little. But most rats are in between. So that resembles a human behavior as well, right? You have mothers that are highly mothering and mothers that couldn't care less, and most mothers are somewhere in between. So if you look at these rats, so all you do, you observe them and put them in separate cages. So you put the high lickers in one cage, not the mothers, but the offspring and the low lickers in another cage, and then you let them grow and they're adults now. Their mothers are long buried, and you look in the brain and you see that those who had high licking mothers express a lot of glucocorticoid receptor gene, and those so are lawmakers express no, that reflects a number of factors and that results in a different stress response, but this is not the only difference. We found later on there are hundreds of genes that are differently expressed. So if you get in a mutation, you know polymorphism once in a million. Here, just the motherly locking just hundreds of genes in one shot, and it changes them in a very stable way that you can look at the old rat and you can say whether it was licked or not. But you can also save by behavior. So if you walk to the cages to the room, the rats that were poorly lit are highly anxious, hard to handle, aggressive, and the rats that were very well handled as off as little pups. Sea creatures are inspiring the latest devices that harness wave power. This one, called the oyster, sits on the sea floor, and opens and closes as waves pass over it. Cables attach it to generators on the shore. Since the November 2009, it's been powering 9,000 homes in the Orkney Islands. Another device looks like a snake. The anaconda is made from a rubber rube filled with water that floats just below the surface. When the swell hits the front of it, the tube squeezed above ripples down its links and power a turbine in its tail. Prototypes are currently being tested, but the full-scale version will be 2,000 meters long. This system also looks like a snake, but this one is made of steel. It floats near the surface, where waves make its joints move. This drive hydraulic system that power electrical generators, like the anaconda. It's still being tested. Results will prove that these devices are up to the job of supplying viable sources of green energy. I've been written non-fictions for years actually, but secretly I wanted to be a novelist. When I first started writing at the age of 30 was with the intention of writing a fiction. But I took a long detour and for 10 or 12 years and wrote non-fiction, which I absolutely had no regret about it at all. I think it exactly the right thing for me to do. But that dream took away inside of me to do this. Now I remember reading something that Eudora Welty wrote, who is, you know, the great novelist who has a big influence on me actually, and she said no art ever came out of not risking your neck. And I think she is absolutely right about that. It doubts that way to me at that time, and it actually feels that way to me every time I sit down to write something. Finally, in the early 90s, I took my deep breath and started writing fiction. It felt risky to me at the time to do that. And one of the very first things that I wrote was what I thought was going to be the first chapter of the novel called The Secret Life of Bees. I wrote it in 1992, and it is actually and essentially the first chapter of the novel, as it is now. This is the first ocean deployment of two new high-precision instruments designed to monitor the Earth signals from the seafloor. This housing contains the tilt meter and nano bottom pressure recorder and the associated electronics and cabling used for power and communications. The instruments were deployed on the seafloor by a remotely operated vehicle as part of the Mars Seafloor Observatory test bed located at a depth of 3,000 feet in Monterey Bay. In this first test deployment in the ocean, it have already detected the ground motion from several large earthquakes as far from the Mars site as Chile and the Mariana Trench. In the future, the instruments will be part of a global network of cabled seafloor observatories. Because of their precision, these two new instruments are already detecting signals, which could never be measured before. A painter hangs his or her finished pictures on a wall, and everyone can see it. A composer writes a work, but no one can hear it until it is performed. Professional singers and players have great responsibilities, for the composer is utterly dependent on them. A student of music needs as long and as arduous a training to become a performer as a medical student needs to become a doctor. Most training is concerned with technique, for musicians have to have the muscular proficiency of an athlete or a ballet dancer. Singers practice breathing every day, as their vocal cords would be inadequate without controlled muscular support. String players practice moving the fingers of the left hand up and down, while drawing the bow to and fro with the right arm, two entirely different movements. Singers and instruments have to be able to get every note perfectly seven in tune. Pianists are spared this particular anxiety, for the notes are already there, waiting for them, and it is the piano tuner's responsibility to tune the instrument for them. But they have their own difficulties. The hammers that hit the string have to be coaxed not to sound like percussion, and each overlapping tone has to sound clear. This problem of getting clear texture is one that confronts student conductors. They have to learn to know every note of the music and how it should sound, and they have to aim at controlling these sound with fanatical but selfless authority. Technique is of no use unless it is combined with musical knowledge and understanding. Great artists are those who are so thoroughly at home in the language of music that they can enjoy performing works written in any century. It is commonly believed in United States that school is where people go to get an education. Nevertheless, it has been said that today children interrupt their education to go to school. The distinction between schooling and education implied by this remark is important. Education is much more open-ended and all-inclusive than schooling. Education knows no bounds. It can take place anywhere, whether in the shower or in the job, whether in a kitchen or on a tractor. It includes both the formal learning that takes place in schools and the whole universe of informal learning. The agents of education can range from a revered grandparent to the people debating politics on the radio, from a child to a distinguished scientist. Whereas schooling has a certain predictability, education quite often produces surprises. A chance conversation with a stranger may lead a person to discover how little is known of other religions. People are engaged in education from infancy on. Education, then, is a very broad, inclusive term. It is a lifelong process, a process that starts long before the start of school, and one that should be an integral part of one's entire life. Schooling, on the other hand, is a specific, formalized process, whose general pattern varies little from one setting to the next. Throughout a country, children arrive at school at approximately the same time, take assigned seats, are taught by an adult, use similar textbooks, do homework, take exams, and so on. The slices of reality that are to be learned, whether they are the alphabet or an understanding of the working of government, have usually been limited by the boundaries of the subject being taught. For example, high school students know that they're not likely to find out in their classes the truth about political problems in their communities or what the newest filmmakers are experimenting with. There are definite conditions surrounding the formalized process of schooling. Television, the most pervasive and persuasive of modern technologies, marked by rapid change and growth, is moving into a new era, an era of extraordinary sophistication and versatility, which promises to reshape our lives and our world. It is an electronic revolution of sorts, made possible by the marriage of television and computer technologies. The word television, derived from its Greek, tele, distant, and Latin, visio, sight, roots, can literally be interpreted as sight from a distance. Very simply put, it works in this way: through a sophisticated system of electronics, television provides the capability of converting an image, focused on a special photoconductive plate within a camera, into electronic impulses, which can be sent through a wire or cable. These impulses, when fed into a receiver, television set, can then be electronically reconstituted into that same image. Television is more than just an electronic system, however. It is a means of expression, as well as a vehicle for communication, and as such becomes a powerful tool for reaching other human beings. The field of television can be divided into two categories determined by its means of transmission. First, there is broadcast television, which reaches the masses through broad-based airwave transmission of television signals. Second, there is non-broadcast television, which provides for the needs of individuals or specific interest groups through controlled transmission techniques. Standard usage includes those words and expressions understood, used, and accepted by a majority of the speakers of a language in any situation regardless of the level of formality. As such, these words and expressions are well defined and listed in standard dictionaries. Colloquialisms, on the other hand, are familiar words and idioms that are understood by almost all speakers of a language and used in informal speech or writing, but not considered appropriate for more formal situations. Almost all idiomatic expressions are colloquial language. Slang, however, refers to words and expressions understood by a large number of speakers but not accepted as good, formal usage by the majority. Colloquial expressions and even slang may be found in standard dictionaries but will be so identified. Both colloquial usage and slang are more common in speech than in writing. Colloquial speech often passes into standard speech. Some slang also passes into standard speech, but other slang expressions enjoy momentary popularity followed by obscurity. In some cases, the majority never accepts certain slang phrases but nevertheless retains them in their collective memories. Every generation seems to require its own set of words to describe familiar objects and events. It has been pointed out by a number of linguists that three cultural conditions are necessary for the creation of a large body of slang expressions. First, the introduction and acceptance of new objects and situations in the society. Second, a diverse population with a large number of subgroups. Third, association among the subgroups and the majority population.